I trusted him. He was my friend, and now I'm chained for the rest of my life." These were the words of Old Man Lin after one of the people he trusted most betrayed him and ended up being the culprit of his imprisonment. But how did this happen? Stay until the end of the video and find out. The war between Old Man Lin and the Traitors of Barrio 18 was a conflict that had been brewing for years in the gang underworld. This rivalry, which had intensified over the years, wasn't just a clash of interests or territories, but a confrontation fraught with betrayal, blood, and revenge. To understand the origin of this dispute, it's necessary to go back to Lin's early days on the streets, when he wasn't yet the man who would later lead the gangs with an iron fist, but rather an ambitious young man who was beginning to gain power and respect. In those days, Old Man Lin didn't see the neighborhood. 18 not an enemy, but a potential ally. The streets were divided between different gangs, each fighting for its own territory, but the strength of the Mara and the Barrio 18 was such that the two reached an unofficial understanding. It wasn't an alliance in the traditional sense, but there was mutual respect and a tacit agreement not to interfere in each other's affairs. That balance, although tense, it maintained peace for some time and allowed both organizations to grow in their respective areas. However, over time, some members of the Barrio 18 began to question this truce. They believed that Old Lin was using this peace as a way to gain more power and that he would eventually seek to dominate all the streets. Tensions began to escalate when one of the leaders of the Barrio 18, a man known as El Chueco, began to mobilize his followers with the idea that the truce with Lin was just a weakness, disguised as Chueco thought that the Mara were accumulating resources and connections that would jeopardize his gang's autonomy. So he decided to break the agreement and launch a surprise attack against a group of the Mara. This attack, although not fatal, was enough to break the peace, and Lin's reaction was swift. Furious at what he considered a betrayal, Lin gathered his men and launched a violent counterattack, leaving behind a message that any betrayal would be punished with blood. Lin's retaliation was brutal. The Mara assaulted several key points in Barrio 18, sending a message that any betrayal would be punished with blood. However, Barrio 18 was not intimidated. Instead, this violence only strengthened El Chueco's followers, who, now convinced that he was a threat that must be eliminated, began planning a full-scale confrontation. Once upon a time, it became an open war that shook the streets and, over time, shaped an entire generation of young people who found themselves caught up in a cycle of hatred and revenge. As the years passed, the clashes between the two sides became increasingly bloody. It wasn't just about territory or power. Now there was a history of hatred between them, an endless chain of violent acts that fueled the conflict. Both sides engaged in ambushes in the shadows, carrying out quick attacks in neighborhoods controlled by the other and expanding their influence. In other districts, the shootings and revenge became so common that no one remembered what the spark was. The initial spark was that the Barrio 18 and the gangs could never coexist in peace. However, things changed when El Chueco was killed in one of those confrontations. His death created a void in Barrio 18, and it was at this moment, when a group known as the Traitors emerged. There were members of Barrio 18 who had lost faith in conventional fighting methods and instead preferred stealth, ambush, and betrayal. For them, there was no honor in an open war against the Mara, only survival and revenge. Their strategy was different. They began to infiltrate its members into the circuits near Old Lin, gaining his trust and betraying him from within. Although some of their first attempts were unsuccessful, they eventually managed to carry out devastating attacks that left the Mara in a constant state of paranoia. Old Lin, aware that his enemy had changed, adapted his tactics, becoming even more ruthless and distrustful. The violence escalated again, but now it was a game of strategy where every move could be a trap. The Traitors of Barrio 18, experts in sowing chaos, used their knowledge of the streets and social media to publicly humiliate the Mara by spreading images of captured and tortured members as a warning. Lin, in response, ordered mass arrests of Barrio 18 members, using torture as a tool to extract information about the traitors. The cycle of violence reached its peak when one of the traitors' leaders managed to deceive a trusted man of Lin's, who led them directly to the old man's hideout. However, Lin had always anticipated this move. Instead of falling into the ambush, he set a trap that captured several of the traitors, including one of their leaders. The gang celebrated this victory as a brutal act. Lin ordered the capture to be executed in a video that was later sent to the 18th Ward as a declaration of total war. Over the years, Lin had imposed his power with brutal force, and his reputation had grown like a ghost that terrorized the streets and dominated those who challenged his leadership. However, in the complexity of criminal networks, loyalty has limits and a price. The traitors knew this well and also understood that to bring down someone as powerful as Lin, they needed a master plan, one that was as lethal as it was silent. The strategy began with a meticulous infiltration of Lin's ranks. A trusted man everyone called the Tigre had been secretly recruited by the traitors with a seemingly impeccable record and a demeanor that conveyed a sense of cunning. The Tigre slowly drew closer to Old Man Lin's inner circle. He knew that any mistake would be fatal, as Lin's paranoia was no mere rumor. The man had eyes and ears everywhere, and any hint of betrayal was punished mercilessly. But the Tigre played his role perfectly, showing respect and loyalty in his every move. No one suspected that behind his facade beat the heart of a traitor. The Tigre used every opportunity to gain Lin's trust and, over time, became one of his closest collaborators. With skill, he feigned contempt for the 18th Ward, which reinforced Lin's belief that the Tigre was one of his own. Lin, although always curly-haired, began to trust him, giving him access to privileged information and allowing him to be present at key meetings. The traitors, for their part, monitored the Tigre's movements from a distance, sending him careful instructions so that he would not arouse their suspicions. They knew that the information on Old Lin's whereabouts was invaluable and that if they shared it with the authorities at the right time, they could get rid of their greatest enemy without raising a single weapon. Over time, the Tigre obtained what he needed. Details about a safe house that Lin used to hide when he felt the authorities were pursuing him too closely. This property was known only to a few, and Lin considered it one of the safest refuges. The Tigre, however, handled the situation with extreme caution. He knew that any false move could cost him his life instead of acting immediately. He waited patiently for the perfect moment to convey the location to the traitors and, through them, to a key contact within the police force. The night of the capture was a carefully and meticulously planned operation. Upon receiving the information, the authorities knew they couldn't waste the opportunity. Lin was one of the most wanted criminals, and any failed attempt to capture him could result in his ultimate escape. The traitors, for their part, were expectant, knowing that this betrayal would mark the end of one era and the beginning of another. They had played every card with precision, and now all that remained was to see the results of their master plan. The police officers arrived at the safe house in a covert operation with unmarked vehicles and, in absolute silence, surrounded the area before entering, ensuring that there was no possibility of escape. In their arrogance, and with the trust he had in his refuge, never suspected that that night would be his last in freedom. Upon hearing the first knock on the door, he immediately got up, but it was too late. When he tried to reach for one of his weapons, the police burst into the house, pointing flashlights and weapons at him, blinding him. The surprise was absolute, and Old Lin had no choice but to surrender. Surrounded and with no way to escape, he was handcuffed and taken from the scene while the officers secured the area and collected all the evidence they could find. The traitors silently celebrated Lin's capture. It wasn't just a tactical victory, but the result of a long-awaited revenge. They knew that this blow would send a clear message to all who still believed in loyalty to Old Lin. Betrayal had been the most powerful weapon in this war, and they had used it with surgical precision in the days since. As rumors of Lin's capture continued, news began to circulate among gangs that he had been betrayed by one of the His death fell like a bucket of cold water on the Mara, who until then had considered Lin invincible. The Tigre had disappeared without a trace, leaving a void in which only uncertainty and fear remained. Those who had once been loyal to Lin began to question his loyalty and doubt their safety. If Old Lin himself had fallen, what awaited them? Old Lin's life in prison. The first day, he was barely allowed to adapt to the prisoner's uniform, with its rough texture and the foul odor permeating the fabric. It was the only thing they gave him to face a routine of endless punishments. It wasn't long before the guard began to show him what his life would be like from now on, wordlessly. They shoved him and threw him against the walls, tripping him up as if his mere presence was an offense that needed to be constantly punished. The insults became something. Every day, they called it scum, spoil, and other names, and there was no reaction Lin could offer. Any attempt at resistance was met with a beating, sometimes on the sides, other times on the legs where the bruises could be hidden and the brutality wouldn't raise suspicions outside those walls. Humiliation soon went beyond words and blows. The guards knew well how to punish someone like him, who had always had power and who had never known hunger or extreme need. They reduced his food rations until they left him with cold and miserable scraps, sometimes with nothing but a piece of moldy bread and murky water. It was a sadistic game. When he received nothing, they left him in his cell listening to the sounds of the other cells where other prisoners ate their meager rations, and that sound echoed in his ear like a reminder of his new condition. Lin could smell that he ate food from a distance, and his stomach twisted with hunger, but he couldn't do anything. He knew that any complaint would only provoke further retaliation, so he forced himself to endure it without showing the weakness the guards expected to see. The nights offered no rest, instead of letting him sleep. The guards arrived at irregular times to drag him out of his cell and subject him to interrogation sessions that were more like texts. They beat and tortured him. They kept him standing for hours, handcuffed and unable to rest, while he listened to mocking questions about his life on the streets, his accomplishments, and his power. One of the guards, in particular, enjoyed telling him mockingly how his people, his most loyal followers, were now lost, disorganized, and how all his power had vanished. He told him of betrayals, of how the Mara were now seen as an easy target. Although he couldn't confirm if all of this was true, hopelessness was beginning to sink in. The words were a poison. Adding to the hunger, fatigue, and physical pain, the torture weakened his will. The torture was also psychological. They knew that for Lin, control and respect were the most important things. That's why they sought to break him in every way possible, forcing him to perform degrading tasks in front of other inmates. They made him clean the common areas and exposed him to the others, knowing that seeing himself in such a low position would make the rest of the prisoners look at him with contempt and mockery. They gave him a broken broom or a dirty rag and made him clean the bathrooms amid insults and laughter. For Lin, this was more unbearable than the beatings. It was a humiliation that tore at what little remained of his spirit. The days began to merge into an endless nightmare where time lost meaning. The constant hunger became a daily agony, and the pain of the blows left marks on his body that took days to heal, only to be replaced by new ones. The skin on his wrists was raw from the handcuffs they placed on him daily, and his legs ached from being forced to kneel for hours on end without rest. Lin's mind began to play tricks on him. In moments of delirium, he heard the voices of his old allies, of those who had fallen along the way, and of those who had betrayed him. Sometimes, in the midst of the silence of his cell, he saw shadows moving in the corners as if his enemies had come to visit him. From beyond, the loneliness became unbearable, and the days dragged on without hope. However, Lin refused to completely break down. Despite the suffering and the brutality they subjected him to, there was something inside him that remained standing. A spark of hatred, a pent-up rage. Every blow, every insult, and every ration of food that was denied him built up inside him, fueling a desire for revenge that helped him resist. Although he was aware that he had no certainty of escaping or regaining his freedom, that spark of hatred was the only thing that gave him strength. He knew that for the guards, he was already dead in life, but while as if he could cling to any shred of dignity he had left. By the way, if you're enjoying the video, we invite you to give us your like and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. We continue the Mara crisis. For the gang, the capture of their leader wasn't just a blow to their structure. It was a symbol of vulnerability that their rivals and the members themselves were quick to take advantage of. For years, Old Lin had been more than a boss. He was the fatherly figure who directed every move and established order among them. However, without his presence, all that balance began to quickly crumble, and a silent but intense crisis began to brew within the Mara ranks. At first, discontent and fear dominated. The news of the capture spread like wildfire, and with it came uncertainty. No one really knew how long Old Lin would be in prison, nor if rumors of a permanent sentence or even execution circulated among the gang's members, and confidence in the stability of their organization began to crumble overnight. The gangs found themselves without the leadership and direction that Lin had provided. For decades, his presence had been the backbone that held everything together, and without him, many began to wonder if the organization would remain as powerful as before. The power vacuum quickly created internal tensions. The lieutenants, those who had worked side by side with Old Man Lin, began to compete to take control of the gang. Among them were some of the most ruthless and ambitious men who saw Lin's fall as an opportunity to impose their own leadership. However, the lack of a unifying figure led to divisions that deepened. Within weeks, some wanted to follow Lin's style, maintaining an organization of respect and authority, while others they wanted to make risky decisions to quickly gain more power and territory, regardless of the methods used. The internal struggles soon turned into direct confrontations. There were rumors of betrayals and members willing to take up arms against their own brothers to gain control. On several occasions, the leaders of different sectors of the gang exchanged gunfire, each trying to impose their vision. This weakened the organization as they began to lose resources and casualties multiplied, not only on the streets but also in the prisons, where the conflicts also reached the incarcerated members. Distrust had taken root within the gang, and what had previously been a structure of unbreakable loyalty had transformed into a chain of accusations and rivalries. Outside, the gang's enemies saw a golden opportunity. The prisoners of Barrio 18, their historical rivals. They were slow to move strategically to attack the Mara's territories. They knew that with Lin out of the equation, the Mara were weak and disorganized, so they began to occupy the spaces where the gang's presence had been reduced due to internal divisions. Little by little, the Traitors began to take over the corners and neighborhoods that previously belonged exclusively to the Mara. They established sales points and recruited young people who, seeing the fall of their gang, decided to change loyalties in search of protection and power. The internal chaos also affected the Mara's finances. The organization had maintained a stable income thanks to its trafficking and extortion operations, but with Lin's capture and the internal division, their sources of money began to dwindle. External allies, those who collaborated in arms trafficking or sales, lost confidence in the Mara and distanced themselves, fearing that the gang would take over. Could not protect their interests as before, operations became disorderly, and much of the proceeds were diverted into the pockets of lieutenants who were trying to enrich themselves at the expense of a declining organization. What was once a thriving criminal machine now seemed a shadow of its former power. The situation worsened further, with the police and authorities keeping a close watch as the gangs weakened. The police intensified their operations in their territories, conducting raids and making mass arrests in an attempt to dismantle what remained of the gang. Without a strong leader to organize and defend them, many of the low-ranking members turned themselves in, preferring to collaborate with the authorities rather than face internal violence or revenge from rivals. Betrayals multiplied, and informants soon emerged within the gang, providing crucial information about its operations and key members. In prisons, the situation was equally serious for the incarcerated members, many of whom those who had blindly followed Lin now found themselves without leadership, and the disorganization was also reflected in the cells. Rival groups took advantage to make their lives miserable, and the guards, aware of Lin's downfall, increased their retaliation and abuse toward the gang members, without fear of reprisals. And so we come to the end of this video. If you liked it, I invite you to give us a like so we can continue making more videos like this. Also, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our new videos. I wish you a great day. Until next time.